Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the next webinar. This one today, we're going to focus on error proofing in transactional, service, creative, and analytical processes, basically anything that's non-manufacturing. So before we get started, if we could just do a quick sound check. I feel a little bit like the wizard behind the screen. I want to make sure that everyone can hear me. So if you could just raise your hand, please, by pressing the hand icon and let me know I'm coming in loud and clear. Excellent. Okay, good. Those of you who didn't raise your hand, I'm hoping you're hearing me. Thanks very much. I'll go ahead and lower everyone's hand. Okay, so let's take a look at what we're going to be talking about today. I didn't do an introduction on Tuesday's webinar this week on work standardization because I see many of you are repeat attendees, but I wanted to, for some of the new people today, just mention a little bit about myself. I began operations design and management back in the mid-'80s when I was the first employee hired for a healthcare startup. And we grew the organization to, I think it had about 250 people by the time I ended in four years of stay there. We had triple-digit revenue growth every year. And then I did that for a second healthcare company. And so I kind of got my chops in operations management in fairly fast-paced environments. A lot of regulatory, it was in mental health, so it was a lot of regulatory work as well. And then I started my own consulting business in '93, and I currently specialize in lean transformations in non-manufacturing environments. I do have some manufacturing clients, but I tend to work on the office, sales, HR, IT, on those areas of the manufacturing world. And Mike Osterling and I wrote a book that was released a few years back called the Kaizen Event Planner for Non-Manufacturing Processes, as well as a metrics-based process mapping approach and an Excel-based tool, both through Productivity Press. And I currently teach when I'm not at client sites, which is pretty frequently, at client sites, that is. I do teach a couple classes each semester at the University of California, San Diego's Lean Enterprise program. So that's a little bit about my background. Our webinar today is going to go about an hour for content, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. And what we'll be doing is going through the materials that you should have been able to download. There's a slide version where it's single slides per page, or a handout version with 2 slides per page. So hopefully you've been able to get those. They were announced in the reminder webinar or email you got yesterday. That link was there, but you do need to copy paste into a browser. They don't allow live links on GoToWebinar email notices. Okay, so today when you look at your computer, if you're new to the GoToWebinar technology, you should have a viewer window that you're seeing the PowerPoint on, and then a control panel. What you do if you want to either maximize or minimize that control panel, you'll see there's a double arrow icon here. Click that and you can minimize, click it again and you can maximize your control panel. And then you can also control how much of that control panel you see by clicking on your view menu item. As far as listening, you can either be listening in with a telephone or with speakers on your computer. If you're using a telephone, you do need to enter an audio pin, which you'll see on your control panel for today's webinar. And as far as asking questions, when we get to the Q&A section, you're welcome to ask questions throughout, but I will wait until the Q&A section to answer them. There's 2 ways to do it. One would be entering it into the question log on your control panel or raising your hand. I can unmute you and you can ask verbally. And if we're going to be having any kind of discussion about specific error proofing issues that you're dealing with at your company, it may be best for us to talk verbally so we can kind of go back and forth and hear one another. It's a little harder to do one-way communication with the question log. The next thing I'd like to remind you about is when you exit the webinar at the end today, if you would please click File and then select Exit End Webinar. That is the only way you'll get the 5 or 4 little questions I've got at the end that help me in shaping these webinars for the future. I really do listen to all feedback. Many of you have gotten emails from me when I followed up from some of the comments you've made, and I really appreciate as much feedback as possible about how to make these webinars even better. Today we're going to talk about common causes for errors, and we're going to once again go over the key metric for measuring errors. If you've been on the other webinars I've given for value stream mapping, metrics-based process mapping, and standard work standardization, which I did on Tuesday, this will be a review for you. If you're brand new to the webinars, then this may be a new metric for you to be learning. So I'll kind of walk in between the two groups of folks we've got on the phone there. We're also going to talk about error-proofing prioritization, and I'm hoping to challenge your thinking a little bit on what you may be doing as your first priority now and what I would suggest you possibly switch to. Root cause analysis, again, this could be an entire webinar in and of itself, so it's only going to be a small component of today's content, but I am going to very briefly go over those tools for some of you who are newer to improvement. Finally, or not finally, but countermeasures for improving quality. Now, this is not going to get very specific because the specific countermeasures are directly related to the specific errors that you're experiencing. So in the Q&A section, I'd be happy to provide more specifics if you can give me some details about what you're currently struggling with at your company. And then finally, not at the end of the webinar, actually midway through the webinar, I'm going to talk about how you can quantify quality improvement and convert that into productivity gains so you can sell your successes to leadership. All right, that's a big agenda, so let's get going. So many of you are familiar with the Toyota house, and in the Toyota house, the two vertical pillars that hold up the roof of the house are just-in-time and Jidoka. Mike and I, when we were writing our Kaizen event book, translated that into more of a non-manufacturing language by saying basically just-in-time is speed and quality is Jidoka, and when you get to where you're able to succeed in both speed and quality, that's when you get flow. So we're going to talk about the right pillar here today, Jidoka. If you're familiar with the 8 wastes, you'll know that one of the 8 wastes is errors, and it's sometimes referred to as defects. The way I view it is the error is the first action that is made that results in a defect, and then the defect results in the need for rework. So the real waste is the error, not the resulting defect nor the rework you have to do to fix it. And if you look at the plethora of tools that we've got available to solve process problems, the process stabilization tools are what I consider the foundation, the basics that have to be in place before you do anything. And then you can, together with the more advanced tools that are above this line, you can get true flow in your processes. But it all starts with visual management and 5S, work standardization, and quality at the source, or error proofing. So we're going to talk today about that quality at the source. The Japanese term is Poka Yoke for that, and error proofing is the term that I tend to use. Now, one thing that I'd like to make a comment about very quickly about mistake versus error. It may feel like I'm splitting hairs a little bit, but there's a growing movement in the lean community to use the term error instead of mistake. And the reason being that mistake has a little bit of baggage around it, and it's a little bit of a more blame-oriented word. It has a blame energy around it, and so it tends to be a little more people-focused than what the intent is in looking at errors in through the lean lens. So I actually noticed right before we went live today that I still have mistake proofing on one of my slides, but I am trying to transition to the term error proofing because I do see that that term mistake just tends to make people rise up a little bit, and error proofing is much more process focused. So again, you can do whatever you want. LEI, the Lean Enterprise Institute, uses both, so it's not like you have to use error, but I do think it makes some sense. All right, so let's look at the potential impact of poor quality. Now, I'm sure none of this is new to you, those of you that are operating in an improvement arena, but what I'd like to suggest is that you need to get better and better and better at quantifying what this potential impact is in these different areas. So for example, let's talk about cash flow in the financial arena. If you've got errors in any kind of billing function, which is delaying you getting revenue in, then there is definitely a measurement that shows how that cash flow or the slowness of receiving cash impacts the organization. Every organization is different, and from my experience, every CFO is different. So you do need to talk with your CFO to find out how he or she prefers for you to quantify cash flow gains. So if you're getting cash in quicker, there's definitely a financial benefit to that. The other thing also is to look at poor morale. You would need to work with your HR department to see how they currently measure morale, if they measure it at all. And quality problems tend to be a very high contributor to poor morale. So it's something to think about on the people side of things, and then certainly stress and frustration as well. And then when you look at improving quality, one of the interesting things about the legal and regulatory world is when you've got poor quality, you risk being non-compliant with a reg or a standard in the case of an industry self-regulating the body. So in that case, you're likely going to be experiencing not necessarily bottom line reductions in expense, but cost avoidance. And cost avoidance, you have to again talk with your CFO on how he or she prefers you quantify cost avoidance, so you're reducing the likelihood of any kind of a regulatory fine, etc. You know, if you've had fines in the past, obviously you do have a baseline, but if you've never been fined, but there's a risk of being fined, then you need to, you know, make sure you're in alignment on how you quantify that. So now when you look much more specifically, look at the various amounts of labor that it takes when you've got poor quality. And remember that I'm not talking just about output quality of your product or service reaching a customer. We're talking a lot about in-process quality and the time it takes staff to correct information or material that's being passed down a chain within the organization before it ever reaches a customer. So if you look at the process time, or the time it takes to fix those kinds of errors, it can be quite significant. And if you can eliminate the need for that fixing, then you free up a boatload of capacity among your workforce, in addition to all the wonderful gains you get, like better morale and less stress and all those things. Now, in the non-manufacturing world, we don't tend to have as much in terms of material cost, but if you think about material cost in terms of reporting, and any kind of reporting that's going on, especially if you're doing hard copy reporting, there actually is a significant cost even in non-manufacturing for scrap and rework that has to do with physical product. And you can make the extension on these other ones as well. So for those of you who have been around a long time in the quality world, as I have, are probably quite familiar with the 110-100 rule, but it may be new to some of you, that if you are able to take the time to quantify quality, you will most of the time see that there's a 10-fold increase in the cost of correcting a mistake the further down the chain it's caught and corrected. So if you spend your money on prevention, you're going to be spending proportionally a far smaller amount of money than if you're looking at adding in cost through inspection, or worse, when the customer sees the poor quality that you don't mean to pass to the customer, then it's a much higher cost to fix that. So when you're working with leadership and they're having any kind of doubt about whether it's worth spending money to correct a problem at the source, help them understand that, yeah, there's a huge financial benefit in correcting problems right away, not to mention all the soft benefits that come along with that as well. So one of the things I want to talk about now about error proofing is when you get outside of manufacturing and you look at a total budget for an organization, typically 80% of it, and sometimes even higher, is labor. And so when you're looking at error proofing and you've got all these human beings there, the first thing we have to recognize is that people are going to make mistakes. People are not robots. They're not machines. There's no way in many cases to truly, truly, truly error proof. What we can do is error reduce. So we have to just go into this knowing and believing in our heart of hearts that people are going to make errors. And it's our job to make the process, the environment, and the technology work in a way that we reduce those errors as much as possible. So this gets down to something I added this morning to the material. The key Toyota principles are twofold: respect for people and continuous improvement. And when you look at respect for people, think about quality this way: is that anytime someone has to correct something or answer to a supervisor or manager because there's been a mistake made, what typically happens is there's a little bit of a blame vibe in that conversation, and that can't be further from the truth. What's happening is we're not having respect for the workforce by having a process, technology, or an environment that doesn't maximize their ability to be successful. So I'd like you to start helping your leadership team and helping your organization realize that it's actually showing disrespect for people to have a system in place that allows them to make errors and doesn't make it easier for them to be successful. I think if we start turning that finger back toward ourselves instead of toward the workforce, we'll move much more quickly toward very positive resolutions that it shows respect for our workforce. So now let's talk about the different levels of error proofing. Again, where to spend your money is on the prevention side of things. And there's two ways to prevent. We either want to make it impossible to make the error or make it far more difficult to make the error. That's when we have respect for people. Now, if we can't solve that, then the very next phase or level we would want is to make it obvious that an error has occurred. So this gets into this whole idea of how do we make things visual? How do we make it visually apparent that an error has occurred? And then if we've done everything we possibly can on steps 1 and 2, then the final step would be to make it a no impact error where it doesn't really affect anything. Now, this is a lovely thought that we can make processes that have no impact. Unfortunately, it's not very realistic. It is nice if you can do it, and you will see a photo of what we call a no impact error a bit later, but it's a tough one to get, especially in non-manufacturing. So one of the things, back to this whole blame game thing, one of the things we do, and this might be very, very subtle. You may be very good at not blaming your workforce, but yet there's these subtle little messages that get put out there. And even in conversation among your peer group, among superiors and subordinates, whatever you want to call it, there will often be these words like, gosh, they need to be more careful. Or I even hear in a lot of my clients, I hear the L word, the lazy word a lot, and it's very disrespectful, and it just isn't true. There are very few people that come into work saying, I'm just going to screw things up today, or I really don't want to work today. I mean, they're there, but there's a very, very small proportion of the workforce. And yet, when it comes to problem solving, I hear this all the time. And so we have to change our whole thinking and our language to get rid of those kinds of words so that we're not talking about that careful and lazy thing. So that gets down to this idea about be careful signs. I see warning signs everywhere, be careful signs. In fact, there's a website now that has, all it is signs that say be careful, be careful. In the lean world, that's considered to be actually quite insulting to the workforce because they're not trying to not be careful. They are trying to be careful. So telling them to be careful, it's a bit insulting. And so we have to, again, start looking at process, environment, and technology as the solutions to our error problems. I also didn't say this really directly, but let me just say it very directly now. In the quality world, I think it's important for everyone to agree that if there's a quality problem, the organization has failed the worker. Again, if there's a quality problem, the organization has failed the worker that made the error. So if you start with that mindset, it will help a lot in moving forward. So if people aren't the problem, then where is it rooted? Well, one of the things that is a tenet in Lean is, you've probably heard me say this before if you've heard me speak, creativity before capital. So we want to fully leverage our existing technology. Yet, in a technology-heavy world like many of you are in, technology is the process. So it is the place that we have to spend a little bit of money in possibly reprogramming, adding drop-down menus instead of free text fields, limiting people's ability to move on until they do something correct in the system. So I just wanted to be clear on that, yes, we want creativity before capital, but if technology is the process, and that's what people have as their tools to do their work, then we have to spend money on technology. So I see all the time, and I just had a conversation yesterday with a client where the computer is responsible for the data that's dirty that people are then using to do another type of work that they're getting dinged on by an outside agency because of quality problems. And so the data that the workers are dealing with is the problem. That original data entry is the problem, not the people that are doing the work. They're taking the data that's there. And when I challenged the organization on, well, then you need to fix the data entry piece of this. That's where the root cause is, that the data is dirty to begin with. The, the response was, oh, we have no control over that. Oh, they've already done that. Oh, we can't, can't, is what I heard. And so I said gently, well, then I'm afraid you're just going to have to live with your problem. There's nothing I can do to help you. If you're not willing to look at the true root cause and fix the true root cause of problems, I don't have magic dust. And neither do any of you who are on the line who are in an improvement world. So this, you have to become better and better and better at becoming an influence leader and helping leadership understand that the root cause is the root cause is the root cause. And if you don't fix the root cause, you're not going to fix the problem. So here's another really nice thing about looking at quality is that it is one of the easiest areas to mend fractured relationships. I find all the time in working with teams either in a Kaizen event model or a regular project where there'll be tension between either individuals or departments, and it's almost always related to the quality of the information or work being passed from one area to the other and the misunderstanding of what the quality needs actually are. And once you get that clarity around what the, quote, customer, the downstream customer's needs are, the upstream supplier is often extremely ready and able to supply the high quality information that's needed for the downstream customer to do their work. It's just that there's never been that kind of conversation to understand why it's needed, and instead there's been, either subtle or overt feuding going on between individuals and departments that can be solved very quickly and healed very quickly. That's something I love about looking at quality, in-process quality. So those of you that have been around for a while have heard this from the TQM days. You can't inspect in quality. You can't. Quality has to be built in at the source. You may need inspection. You probably don't need as much as you have. You may need it at some level, but you absolutely can't inspect it in. So help your leadership team understand that as well when they're starting to bulk at spending resources on quality at the source kinds of activities. Inspection in non-manufacturing is in the form of reviews, approvals, audits, and signatures. So what we want to do is start looking at making a more robust process so that we can take away that thing that people think is a safety net. In reality, it's not a safety net. It's adding complexity, it's adding time, it's adding labor cost to a process, all because the root cause has never been addressed and the quality problems exist. So our goal needs to be to eliminate that need for inspection. Now, let's talk about this whole idea of how we measure this. In the non-manufacturing world, Lean is bringing to the table something that no other methodology has, and that is this whole concept of you really, 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 really have to measure. And if you can't measure with an objective form of measurement, if there's not data available in the system, for example, then the best case is interviewing the downstream recipient of work on what percentage of the time they receive work that's, quote, usable as is, unquote. That's the best thing you've got until you can build in true objective measurement. And the thing is in the proper environment, those people actually answer those questions quite accurately. They are the ones that do the work, and they're the ones that are familiar with what kinds of quality they're receiving. And so, again, back to something I mentioned on Tuesday's webinars, it takes a skilled facilitator asking good questions to get good responses, and that's what you need to work on. So the in-process quality is what I'm going to focus on today. It's far more revealing about how a process is working than the end-state quality that's being passed on to a customer. And it's the best method for looking at how robust your process is, and it's the only way to see where you've got waste in the process. And finally, it's the way to gain productivity and have more output per person with them feeling more relaxed about their work, not adding more stress to them. You really can have it all if this is done correctly. So PDCA is the structure we use in the Lean world. DMAIC is the structure used in the Six Sigma world, and there are some corporate-specific change methodology out there as well. It's all basically trying to drive the scientific method into problem solving. So whichever one you use, as long as you use it, that's good. So plan, do, check, act. The first thing with planning is gaining a deep understanding about the current state. Don't even try to solve a problem until you understand truly the current state. So the best way to look at the current state in a process is to map it, and you can either map it at a macro level, looking at a strategic plan for improvement, such as a value stream map, or you can map it at the micro level where you're getting down into the weeds and getting every little task detailed out, and that would be a metrics-based process map, which we went over on Tuesday. So the quality of the input from the customer becomes a very, very important element in this whole idea about in-process quality. And teams often feel that they've got absolutely no impact on the customer. They can't affect the quality of the input at all. I got to tell you, that could not be further from the truth. It is 100% of the time that I've ever worked with this kind of a problem, we've been able to impact the quality significantly. Customers want the people that they're working with to be successful. They want to get what they want fast, high quality, and at a reasonable price. So customers want to give good input to get the quality of their output up to where they want it. So that's the first thing we measure. Then we measure the quality of the output within every step in the process. This could be between individuals, it could be between departments at a super high level, it could be between divisions of an organization. It could include external contractors as well as internal departments. Whatever it is, you've got to measure the quality of the output every step along the way. So percent complete and accurate is the name of that metric, and that's the percent of time a downstream customer says that they can perform their work without having to do any kind of rework. And we have 3 different kinds of rework, and I kiddingly call it CACing the work, but CAC is an acronym for correcting information that was supplied, adding information that's missing, or clarifying information that should have or could have been clear. So I liken this to a hairball. Anytime the work comes in and there's a CACing that has to go on, it requires some sort of cleanup in order for the work to then move on. So who does that measurement is it's the downstream customer of that work that's determining that, and any subsequent downstream customer who may also be having problems with the output of a particular step. So it's not just the immediate one, but it could be others down the road. And the other thing is that if others down the road say that the same output created problems for them, you multiply those numbers together to get the final output quality for that particular step. So let's take a look at this. If we've got a customer that's sending in 50% quality, and then we've got 4 steps in the process before the customer receives the final output, and those steps, the quality of the output, by the person at step 2 is determining that step 1's output is 70% good to go. 30% of the time they have to correct, add, or clarify. Step 3 is saying that step 2's output is 85% good. Step 4 is saying, uh-oh, step 3 is only 25% good to go. 75% of the time, step 4 is having to correct, add, or clarify work that they shouldn't have had and didn't really need to be doing. So when we look at an entire process, again, either at a macro level, like a value stream would be, or at a micro level, as in the weeds would be, we're looking at this, in this example, at a rolled first pass yield of only 6%. So only 6 out of 100 orders coming in from the customer, or requests coming in from the customer, are passing through with no hiccups. The rest of them, 94%, have some sort of delay due to quality problems. That delay equals labor effort. That delay translates into frustration, delays, etc. So the way you get that is by multiplying the decimal form of those percentages and then times 100 to get it back into the percentage form for some of you that are newer to this. So 6% is not a good number, but it's the truth, and it's a good foundation from which we can improve. So again, if you're not familiar with value stream mapping, please become familiar with it, because at a strategic level, it is the way to get improvement across an entire value stream. It's great to make little micro improvements in little pockets, but you're likely not going to have big organizational improvement that actually hits customers and bottom line if you don't look at a macro view of how work is done. In either case, whichever mapping you're using, the post-it convention that I use with the paper and post-it kind of mapping would be that the percent complete and accurate goes in the bottom left-hand corner of the person or department responsible for the output. So that 90% means that when they enter the order entry reps get it right 90% of the time. 10% of the time they pass an error downstream. Now, this is difficult to see, and I don't really expect you to see all the details. That's not the point of this. The point is to see that this is a macro-level value stream map for an entire service delivery process, from a customer saying, hello, we need help, till the company gets revenue for providing that service. And if you'll look, what this is saying, you can't really see it very well on your own, so I magnified it a bit for you. The world first pass yield here is only 1.1%. This was a real process about a year ago for an organization. Really, only 1% of the time did work pass correctly without any kind of snags. The rest of the time, tons of snags. So what we do is we take a look at that current state, and that rolled first pass yield in non-manufacturing is very often 0 to 15%. So the current state is often quite sobering for a team and for leadership to realize. But again, from there you can make tremendous improvement. So check this out. 1.1% for the current state. Pretty abysmal, right? So the future state design, team takes a look at all the different improvements they can make to the future state. And again, we're not going to take time to study this in detail. The point here is that all those yellow starbursts are different improvements that need to be made to shorten time and improve quality. And in this case, the projections at the time this was developed were that the quality would be able to go up to 45%. And all those improvements were supposed to be in place in about a 6-month period of time. So this was a 6-month plan for improvement for this entire value stream. So from 1.1% to 45% yields almost 4,000% improvement. Very, very significant improvement. Now, is 45% good enough? No. 45% is still way too low. But, you know, you don't solve world hunger in one day, and you certainly don't solve it even in 6 months in this case. So 4,000% improvement is quite impressive. Now let's look at something here. By improving that quality, you see here process time, or the total touch time for that entire process. So that's every single employee involved in that process for one customer request, 5.9 hours total of work. In the future state, projected numbers are by improving quality and cutting out a few steps, but mainly by improving quality and getting rid of that need to do rework, they're going to be able to get that work done with a collective number of 5.1 hours. So it's 0.8 hours savings. So one would think at first glance, it's not very much. I mean, why can't we go from 5.9 to 3 or something more impressive? Well, hold on, let's look at this. Single hits add up. That amount of savings, that 0.8 hours per service call, when you look at how many service calls per year, this is a big organization, lots of customers, 75,000 service calls per year. When we divide that by the number of available work hours per year, in this case 1875 hours for each employee, that's a savings or a free capacity of 32 people, 32 full-time equivalents. That is how much freed capacity you're gaining by improving quality to reduce that process time 0.8 hours. So again, so that those of you that weren't on Tuesday, let me make it very clear that those 32 people are certainly not laid off. I mean, couldn't be further from the truth. What those 32 people do is you take the freed capacity and you find that there are a plethora of tasks that need to be done in an organization that are not able to get done right now because of all the quality problems that people are always resolving. And let me make another comment right now that I think it was Deming that said this comment, and it blazoned in my head. He said, isn't it interesting how organizations always have time to do things 2 or 3 times and they never have time to fix the first time? You know, and those are those provocative questions that you want to be talking with your leadership team about when you're running into any kind of obstacle for making improvement. It's like, well, okay, so we're willing to have 32 people where all they do is rework? Is that really what we want to do with our budget? So those are the kinds of things where you help educate leadership and become an influence leader within your organization. So in the case of quality, we can improve quality even further by giving people the bandwidth to slow down and think about their work and to just be much more methodical in the work that they do. So in addition to all these other things. All right, so now let's take a look at why do we have errors. There are a lot of reasons why human beings make errors, and they're all reasons that we need to be fixing because that's the reason for the error, not because they're human beings. So training, I have to tell you, this is the thing, it's number one on my list. I have not met yet, not yet, in my 20-some years of doing this work, an organization who I feel does stellar training for new hires so that they really know how to do their work. The closest I have found is Starbucks, but they are far and away above most other organizations. And you can look at my client list on my website. There's some pretty impressive organizations there, and yet training is still ridiculously bad for employees that are coming in and being expected to do a job. Right behind that is no standardized work. How can people be expected to perform at a high level if the work isn't well documented and standardized in a way that enables everyone to be successful? So you've got to spend time on training and standardizing your work. Simplifying the process. We've just gotten into this mindset in many organizations where it seems as though complexity, like people almost thrive on complexity. We've got to go 180 the other way and start thriving on simplicity. We cannot be wrapped up in, let's do this and let's move it here and that, just stop it. We've got to stop it and simplify and get to where people can be more effective in doing their work. Now this one for data entry, this fourth bullet, time delays, this is a big one because what happens is oftentimes the technology doesn't support moving data from one place to another place without there being some kind of a time where people are holding data in their head. So think about yourselves. Anytime you hold information in your head, like I was walking yesterday, I do power walks every day, and I was walking and I had this great idea, and I was very close to home, very close, and I didn't have a paper, pencil, cell phone, nothing with me, and to write it down. And so I was like, okay, I can remember this. I know I can remember this. I'll write it down as soon as I walk in the door. Well, you know what? I got right to my door, and my neighbor was out there and said hello. And I said hello. It took all of 15 seconds, but by the time I got in here, I forgot to write it down. And later in the day, I said, what was that thing I wanted to write down? And I could never remember it. To this minute, I haven't remembered it. So we don't want our staff to have to hold far more important information in their head than my idea. You're asking them to do something where you risk interruptions, delays, just misunderstanding what it was. You don't want people to hold information in their head too long. And I'm not going to go through all these other ones, but multitasking, rushing, poor understanding about internal customer requirements, all these things play into errors. So the first thing we have to do when faced with an error is figure out which one of those reasons or reasons is really the root of the problem. So we have to do a methodical root cause analysis to be clear on what that is. So root cause analysis, I think I'm looking at the list. Most of you are fairly seasoned. I do see some new folks that I'm not familiar with your background. So let's just assume there may be a few people on the phone who are pretty new to this. Root cause analysis is absolutely essential so that you're not guilty of Band-Aid fixes. So you are getting deeply into all the different reasons for errors being made and making sure that you've truly identified those reasons before you figure out what the right countermeasure is for it. And if we don't do root cause analysis, you're very likely going to be temporarily fixing the problem. There are many root cause analysis tools, but if you just get proficient with these four, you'll be miles ahead. And I think that it's every improvement professional's obligation to teach these four tools to every single person you meet, whether it's the CEO or the janitor. You've got to make sure that everyone understands how to solve problems by using root cause analysis. So let's take them very quickly, one at a time. Oh, one thing I want to mention. The other thing to think about is that 5 Whys, for example, is a very effective tool, but unfortunately, in the knowledge work world especially, it's just a little too simplistic for most problems. But I always start there. Always and forever start with 5 Whys and see if I can get to the root with that. And then if it's more complex and you can't get to the root of it with 5 Whys, then you can move on to some of these more advanced tools. So 5 Whys. Here's a case where a report that someone was doing, we were trying to free this person up to be able to do some value-adding work, and one of the big time sappers was this report that was an error report, and of course, my first question is, well, why do we still have errors being created? Why don't we get rid of the errors so we can get rid of the error report? Well, before we could get to that, we decided to look at, well, why is the error report even needed anymore? And it took a series of 5 questions to learn that the fax machine had been bad 10 months earlier, and the data was very hard to read, and so there were errors being made because of that. But the fax machine had been replaced, but no one had changed this report. And I find this a lot, where a new world order is established and yet the old process remains. So this is a case where 5 Whys worked effectively, and we were able to nip it in the bud in about 5 minutes. So it was great. Now, for something a little more complicated, this problem analysis tree, which is not one of the original 4, because I kind of consider this problem analysis tree 5 Whys on its side. And this becomes both a scoping tool as well as a root cause analysis tool. So this is out of John Shook's learning, Managing to Learn. It's one of the 2 A3 books out there for A3 problem solving. So again, it's John Shook, the father of value stream mapping. It's called Managing to Learn. And this is how he took 2 different categories of a problem, late documents and poorly translated documents, and then started separating out those problems. And if you go from left to right, when you get to the right column, you're to root cause on most of them. Not all of them, but you're all the way to root cause on most of them. So if you find your 5 Whys is too simple to use for the problem, you might want to try this problem analysis tree, which is a little more expansive version of 5 Whys. Now, what I find the most effective and powerful tool ever for anyone to use is the cause and effect diagram, or it's also known as Fishbone or Ishikawa. So the Fishbone diagram looks at a problem or some kind of an effect from 6 different perspectives. And it used to be called the 6 M's because we had man for people and Mother Nature for environment, but now it's not quite 6 M's. So, but it's these 6 elements that you look at a problem to see if there's any possible reason why that category is causing the effect that we're looking at. So, and you can use other categories if appropriate, but I do find that these categories tend to be highly effective most of the time. So what this is, it's a brainstorming tool. It's not telling you what the root cause is. It's telling you what the possibilities for root cause are. So you're going to have to do more work after cause and effect diagram to figure out which ones are real, but at least it gets you closer to uncovering all possibilities and not just jumping to a conclusion because it's the first thing that someone thinks of. So here's how it works. Here's a case of, this is a service call environment where the customer's having to call service techs back, meaning that they didn't do good quality work the first time, and looking at all the possible reasons for those callbacks. So the team was looking at all of this and found that when they started actually looking at all the real callbacks that had actually occurred, there were 6 reasons that kind of stood out among the others as being the highest volume. So a team needs to figure out after they've brainstormed which ones are the highest volume. Sometimes there's actual data you can look at. In the case of, I just finished a big project on medication error reduction in a hospital, and we had actual data of reported errors. We didn't have data on non-reported errors, but we did have data on reported errors, so we could look at all the possible reasons for those reported errors and come up with a pretty good a guess. I mean, it was a smart guess, but it was still a guess on the actual errors and the proportions of root causes. And here is actually the fishbone for that project in looking at the possible medication errors. This is on a whiteboard. And what you'll notice is the different colors, I gave each team member a different color pen for them to go up and put the reasons. And then you'll also see in some cases, like up here, you'll see sub-reasons. So there's a reason and then sub-reasons. Here's a reason and sub-reasons for it. So you can get a little more detailed if need be on that kind of a fishbone diagram. But it is highly effective to get people thinking through all the possibilities and not jumping to conclusions. So how do you quantify it? Well, a simple check sheet, a manual check sheet is better than nothing. If you've got data, that's desirable. That's the most desirable, of course. But if you don't, then you do a simple check sheet, and then from that you can do what we call Pareto analysis. So here's a check sheet. This is not a quality problem. This is a late shipment problem. But it was literally giving a group of customer service support people a check sheet with these possible reasons that were from the fishbone diagram, and then for a few days they tallied how many calls they got where that was the reason. And then you can do this in front of a Kaizen event if you're going to be running a Kaizen event, or in some cases you can actually get on day one enough information, you can throw it out there to the people who get the calls, get data, and then on day two have enough data that you can focus in and prioritize what countermeasures you need based on the frequency of these problems. Now, Pareto analysis is taking all of those different numbers you get, the frequency of problems, and looking at it so that you're only focusing your attention on the vital few that tend to cause the many. So we don't want to focus our attention on all of the problems because we'll never get it done. This is a means to prioritize. So in the case of, for example, credit application delays, these along the bottom were the fishbone categories: no signature, insufficient bank information, etc. So those were the ideas that came out on the fishbone. Then we looked at the actual data on how many of these credit application delays was that the reason. And what you do is you rank them in order from highest to lowest, and then you can use an automated system to do this, or and there's many, many different programs you can do. It's easy to set up in Excel, actually. But you're looking to find 80% of the effects, 80% of the problems are usually due to 20% of the reasons. So this is the 80-20 rule that Pareto discovered. And so in this case, we're not going to worry about no prior address or no credit history. We're going to look at the countermeasures for the problem of having no signature or insufficient bank information. And that might be as simple as changing the document that the customer is using to submit. This is where we have tremendous impact on the input quality coming from a customer. So you see, we have a lot more control than we think we do with customers. Now, when you start approaching, so let's say you've done root cause analysis and now it's time to put a countermeasure in place. What we tend to do is we tend to go all the way to this third solution traditionally, where we put an inspection in place so that we're making sure that we're not passing errors to a customer. But a lean priority would be 180 the other way. It would be spending your effort on avoiding making errors, so true error proofing and error reducing, instilling quality at the source. But this is the order in which you work in a lean world. We don't want to put too much time into inspection. So in terms of redesigning the process, the first thing you challenge the team to think about and to be incredibly innovative is, how do we make it impossible to make the error? Then how do we make it harder? Then how do we make it obvious error has occurred? And then how do we make it so there's no impact to the error? So the same four we've gone over before, but now we're going to take a little example of how those play out in a non-manufacturing world. So making it impossible to make the error is a little tricky in non-manufacturing because we don't have equipment. In the case of manufacturing or a very physical environment like we see in manufacturing, we can do all kinds of things with equipment to make it impossible. And here, this is a press. And what was happening was they were having some worker injury from hands getting into the press. And so they came up with these two round circles on either side. Hands must be on there. There needs to be pressure applied there in order for the press to operate. The press will not operate unless the operator's hands are on those two circles and obviously out of the problem of being in the press itself. So they made it impossible with the equipment to make the error of having your hands smashed in a press. Okay, so think about, even though you're not in a physical world like this, think about these physical fixes that you see out there in the world. When you come back to data, knowledge, information, you can apply the same thinking, and you might come up with a very innovative solution by thinking about these physical things. In the case of data entry and data management, there are ways to make it impossible to go on. So here's me trying to buy a book, and I forgot the city, and it would not let me go on. The system would not let me go on until I entered my city in there. And so that's a case of using technology in a way to help the worker be successful, or the customer be successful, in my case me, so that they don't have to deal with incorrect or incomplete order at the end. So your IT department needs to be highly engaged in mistake proofing when you start into a very IT intensive environment, as most of you are. Now, that's an example of impossible. Making it harder to make an error, here's an example of using IT to say, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? So that's what I think of when I think of making it harder to make the error, is that question, are you sure that's what you want to do? So in healthcare, for example, if a nurse is hanging IVs, there are a couple of different things when they're loading in information into an automated IV system. Like, for example, if they put in weight in anesthesiology, for example, if they put the amount of anesthetic and then the weight of the person, there's a database in that says, are you sure that's what you want to do based on that weight? So it makes it harder to make an error. They can still override it and say, yes, I'm sure, and they can still make the error, but at least it stops the person and says, you better think about this. Are you sure this is what you want to do? So here's an example of me trying to make a change on my website and contribute, the program I use, helping me out quite a bit. Actually, I faked my errors just so I could get that for you. So then the next thing is, if you can't make it impossible and you can't make it harder and the error is going to still happen, you certainly need to make it obvious that the error has occurred. So think about the possibility of putting some kind of visual cue, or you could even think about sound cues, like when you check out at a grocery store and you hear the beep, beep, beep. The reason why the beep, beep, beeps are there is so if they don't hear a beep, they know that they've missed ringing up an item. So there's all kinds of things you can do with sound that's not too obnoxious in an open cubicle environment, but think about that and have your teams think about sound. And then an example of smell, which I don't know how much this carries weight in a non-manufacturing office service knowledge work environment, but think about how natural gas has no smell, so they've added a sulfur-smelling substance to natural gas so that we can easily smell leaks. And I'm sure there's an example of touch, but I couldn't think of one off the top of my head. But think about that, again, just to get people being innovative about the possible fixes to a data information intensive environment. You want to make that system very robust so that it can tolerate the error at the end. So here's an example of, look at here, we've got spell check and grammar check in Word. And this is an example of how we're able to use technology to make it obvious that an error has occurred. Now again, someone could ignore that and they could go on, and if they're in a rush, they might, but at least it gives you a chance to correct the error because it's been made visually obvious that the error has been made. So again, this is where you've got to get with your programmers and look at the system and start thinking about ways to make it obvious an error has occurred. So finally, making the system robust so it tolerates the error. This is the obvious picture that I just always think about on what exactly that means. So here's an example of when it used to be back in the day. If you left the gas nozzle in the gas tank and you pulled away, nothing happened, or actually something horrible happened. Now they have quick release valves on those hoses so that if you happen to pull away, as this car did, nothing happens. No blowing up, no gas tank falling over, no nothing. Now, when you're back in the data and knowledge work world, it is very difficult to have a no impact error. So what we need to do is think about this whole idea of inspection and whether or not we really need to put inspection in place or not. Remember, inspection costs money. Inspections done by people typically. You can do some systems inspections, but a lot of times people are involved, and people are expensive. And so what's not good about using people to inspect is that upstream, when people know there's an inspection in place, they tend to be less diligent, and so they tend to be a little less careful in doing the work because they know someone downstream may catch it. And at first, when I first heard this, this was years and years ago, I first heard this, I'm like, oh, I don't know about that. I don't think I'm less diligent. And then I wrote my book, and I found that the closer I got to my deadline, so think about your people and deadlines they've got, the faster I was working, as your people do, your staff does. I knew that there was going to be a copy editing, basically an inspection downstream. And so I got less diligent at correcting my own errors because I knew there was going to be an editor. And that's when I went, Eureka, this is human nature. We do all do this. When we know there's going to be a downstream inspection, we think that we can rely on that. So what you want to do in a true lean world is take that safety net away and make it so there is no downstream inspection, so that people have to be diligent. And then, of course, building a robust process, creating a good environment, and using technology to be your friend are all other things you do there. So make sure that when you're establishing this quality culture, that in addition to this whole idea that you make problems visible instead of hiding from them, which is very traditional in non-manufacturing, and this whole concept that we stop and fix problems immediately instead of letting them linger and linger and linger, make sure that the inspection idea is used as a last resort, not the first solution. It is expensive and it doesn't solve the problem. Okay, so I just want to make one more comment about inspection to make sure that everyone's hearing this loud and clear. What I'm talking about with inspection is someone else inspecting the work. Self-inspection is absolutely necessary. And so there are all kinds of things you can do with self-inspection. For example, checklists. And giving people a little thing that they look at before they pass work on to make sure that they've done everything that they need to do. What is a little less desirable would be downstream inspection, where people are cross-trained to the point where they know what they should be looking for, and if the work is not handed over correctly, they send it back upstream to the person who did the work. That's the best way to get quality built into the process. What's even less desirable is a third-party inspection before it reaches a customer, and what's an absolute no-no is inspection after the fact, because that does nothing to solve the problem. The customer's already gotten it, and most third-party inspections, I find, are not being well utilized in root cause analysis and making continuous improvement. So as far as looking at error-proofing data entry, there are all the things we've already talked about, but the one thing that I want to talk about here is this whole idea of grouping data and cadence. I've noticed a number of my clients have long numbers that people have to enter in, and there are a fair number of errors when they're entering those long numbers. And there's been a ton of research over 50-some years on grouping data, which is why a Social Security number is broken into 324. And it's why phone numbers are broken into 334. There is a magic in 2, 3, and 4 being what our brain can reasonably handle. When you get beyond 4 items, our brains tend to start wigging out. And so think about the whole idea of grouping cadence. Reading aloud, I had an assistant for one summer not too long ago that kept on making errors, and one of the things we realized was that she was holding information in her head, and she tended to be a very visual person. And so when she started reading out loud, and very quietly, of course, you know, especially in an open cubicle environment, when she started reading out loud quietly, her quality went through the roof. So that is another thing. And then finally, you've got to have built into your expectations for productivity, ample time for self-inspection before they pass work on. So I'm not a big fan of productivity standards. In fact, there's a growing body of evidence out there that productivity standards don't get us anywhere where we want to go. But certainly if you're going to have them, make sure you're allowing time for self-inspection. Another idea that you should be thinking about is the repeating order thing. Now, this doesn't work in all environments, but if you'll notice in the good Starbucks, they don't all do this anymore, but the person at the cash register taking the order says the order out loud. The barista who's doing the order repeats the order. And right then they're able to catch mistakes before the order is already done and the person receives the wrong order. So thinking about any application for that in your environment is another good one. And then finally, I think look a lot at your hardware situation and the whole ergonomic, the way things are physically arranged, and the possibility of using dual monitors so that you get people so that they're not having to hold information in their head. I just went to dual monitors about, I don't know, 8 months ago, and oh my gosh, it is a lifesaver from a quality perspective and a time saver. Well worth the money. Okay, so now another couple things to think about is what you want to do in the training element. Let's just jump here to number 3 here, training, is make sure that the training includes the person watching it, doing it, and then teaching someone else how to do it. That's the best way to train, and it's what I see woefully lacking in many corporate training programs. Again, when they're learning a new task, they need to see how it's done, they need to do it, and then they need to teach others how to do it. And it's that teaching phase that really cements the knowledge. The other thing, I mentioned cross-training a bit ago, but one of the things that I think most non-manufacturing operations need to do far more of is cross-training people within functional areas. Cross-training people across functional areas, not within them. You want people in one department to be able to do work that another department does to help out when there are bottlenecks and to also get better at catching errors. And then, of course, you need to stop and fix the problem immediately. But that cross-training gives you a lot. So I think that we've talked plenty about some of these other reasons, but I want to talk about ambiguous information, because a lot of times when you get back down to why, for example, data entry errors occur, ambiguous information is a big part of it. So if you think about, just look at this visual for a second of these two instruction packets for a stove. If you look at the way that the stove is physically arranged, it invites errors. Stove B has a much more clear association between the controls and the burners. Stove A, it's, take your guess. I'm sure they're labeled, but it's still easy to make mistakes. So what you want to do when it comes to knowledge and information is make sure that the information being passed down from person A to person B and to person C, etc., is as unambiguous as possible. So in healthcare, for example, I see, the information is so ambiguous that people are spending a lot of time either clarifying it, or worse, they're making assumptions that are going on and then creating errors, in some cases fatal errors, based on ambiguous information. So keep your eye out for that and work with your teams to create clarity in all the information that's being passed. All right, so standardized work we covered on Tuesday, but I wanted to make sure that you just remember that the whole benefit of standardized work is to maintain consistent quality and then also productivity and safety. But quality is the reason. Quality outcomes is the reason for standardized work. So review, standardize all your work, build in quality. Make the problems visual if they occur. Get a culture where the work stops immediately and you solve problems immediately when an error is detected. Toyota stops their line 1,000 times a day. That's a lot of stopping. But if you don't get that culture in, then you'll let problems fester, and then it costs a lot more time and effort to fix them down the road, a lot more money. Cross-train your people so that they're better able to detect them, and get inspection out of the equation to the fullest degree possible. Process design is it. Technology helps, environment helps, but process design is the way that you build quality into your processes and stop blaming people for work that they could be doing much more effectively if the process were built correctly. So today we were going to talk about the common causes for errors, what the metric is that you should be using to measure your current state and then your projected future state, and then monitor that future state once it becomes current state and make continuous improvement from that point on. What your prioritization should be in error proofing, and it's not going to inspection first. Root cause analysis tools, again, very high level and fast review, but hopefully enough that you can start using them tomorrow or today, this afternoon if you haven't already. Some ideas for the kinds of countermeasures you look at: standard work, visuals, cross-training, those kinds of things. And then finally, that whole idea of reducing process time because you've built quality, the formula for translating that into productivity gains. So it was fast, but we covered a lot, and hopefully you've picked up some tips for moving forward. We're about to go into the Q&A, but I want to just point out a couple of references that are helpful. In Chapter 11 of the Toyota Way, Leiker goes into great detail about the Toyota approach for quality. And I don't know how many of you are following the whole Toyota situation, but what we knew we were going to find out in the beginning, we are now finding out that almost all of the problems have been operator error. Almost every single case of a Toyota problem has been now proven to be driver error. So we can all put to rest that whole idea that Toyota was messed up. I mean, they did grow too fast. The CEO admitted that. They did lose a little control of their principles. That he admitted that, and they certainly didn't do a good PR job when this thing started. We know that. But there's been a new Wall Street Journal article out in the past few weeks that has really debunked case by case, and it's good news for all of us. Chapter 8 in Lean Hospital, for those of you that are in healthcare, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. This guy, Mark Graban, knows whereof he speaks, and it's a very well-written and easy-to-read book. So Chapter 8 is the chapter on error proofing. And then I just want to mention also the next couple webinars coming up, Kaizen events and problem solving. And then I'm going to do one on sustaining change sometime in October, but I'm still working on client engagements and some scheduling there, so I'll let you know about that. If you're not already registered for the for these webinars, you can by going on my site. You can also subscribe to my monthly newsletter, which usually has an article that's tips and tricks of Lean, as well as new resources. And then I forgot to mention this on Tuesday. I am a guest on Lean Radio today. It's a daily radio program out of Rhode Island, and I'm going to be talking about A3 problem solving today, and specifically the leadership development piece of A3 problem solving. That's at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific Time today. 790business.com. So let's go ahead now and open it up to questions. Hopefully you have lots of questions, and I would love to see some specifics on some of your, or hear some specifics on your problems that you're working with in your organization and some of the error proofing challenges that you've got in the non-manufacturing world. So the first question was about this webinar. It will be available. I don't have a tab yet on my website that leads you to these, but I am recording it, and so I will have it available. If you want to email me, I can send you the link to that to the webinar. They'll be up on my web by January. I'm doing kind of a massive wave of improvement to my website, and it's going to be part of it is that all these webinars will be available. So yes, it will. Just give me an email if you'd like it. Okay, let me look at the questions. Okay, most of it are people that are leaving and saying thank you. So you are most welcome. Thank you for attending. Hope to see you on some future webinars. Okay, Dana, your hand just went up, so I'm going to go ahead and assume that you'd like to ask a question verbally, and if for some reason you don't, we'll correct that. So I'm clicking you to unmute. Dana, can you hear me? Dana, I don't know whether if you're using speakers to listen in, then you would need a mic in order to ask a question. If you're using the telephone, then perhaps you haven't put your audio pin in. Oh, you don't have a question. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to mute you again, and I'm going to lower your hand. Okay, thank you. Any questions? We have plenty of time. Okay, Dean, your hand just went up. So, your hand just went down. So I will assume you do not have a question that you want to ask verbally. Are any of you dealing with error reducing right now, where you have a real situation and you would like, I mean, we've got not only me here, but we've got a number of very seasoned improvement folks on the line that could help you in whatever it is you're working on right now. Okay, here's a question. Question from Mike. To help us standardize our employee training, we'll be implementing Diane Walters' Training on the Job, which is a team-driven approach. Have you heard of it? I have not. However, I wonder if it's related to training within industry, TWI, which was a forerunner to the lean approach that we used here in the U.S. during World War II. And it's having a resurgence, and it's a very structured approach to training people. It was actually developed back when we were training women to create, I forget what were women, I mean, I'm not that old. I'm trying to remember what women were in the factories doing. Was it bombs? I guess they were making bombs. But all of a sudden there were all these new people in the workforce that had never been in the workforce that needed to be trained quickly so we could respond quickly and put out a lot of product. And so I assume they were bombs that we were creating. But TWI is a wonderful, wonderful tool. I'm not sure if that's what Diane Walters is. And Patrick Graup, G-R-A-U-P-P, is one of the leaders in TWI. And I'm looking at my bookshelf right now to see if I can see the full name of his book. Let me see. You know what? I think it's called the TWI Workbook. Yeah, the TWI Workbook. Patrick Graup, G-R-A-U-P-P. That's P as in Paul. Now, one thing I will comment on as far as a team-driven approach, when you're looking at quality problems, it has to be a team-driven approach. And it has to be not only the people who are doing the work, but it absolutely needs to include the upstream suppliers to that team, as well as the downstream customers to that team. That's the only way you're going to be able to get quality across the whole process, is to include upstream suppliers and downstream customers. So they really do need to be team-based. And just a quick note about teams. You never want to have more than 10 people on a team because you get too many cooks in the kitchen. You want to have a structure where each functional area has representation on the team, and that person is going back to their peer group both before the activity and during the activity to get information and ideas and share information. So when you have no more than 10, if you're working on a quality problem, I highly recommend that 50% of that team be the people who actually do the work. And I also recommend that within that 50%, you have some of the ones that are maybe poorer performers and some of the higher performers, so that they can help each other see what the various conditions are that are leading to the poorer quality. Because again, a high performer may be a high performer because they're better able to see data chunked a certain way than a poor performer. That doesn't mean that that poor performer is a poor person. It means that we all have different ways of learning. We have all different ways of hearing and seeing things, and there has to be a little bit of flexibility within the workforce to allow for those differences in learning ability. So back to what I mentioned on Tuesday, you want to make sure you don't over-standardize the process. You do need to build in whatever it takes for a person, an individual, to be successful doing that work. And so there may need to be a little bit of variety. So for example, in the case of dual monitors, there should be some flexibility in how specifically people are setting up those dual monitors. They don't have to all be exactly the same. You know, the point being that they've got now a more real estate to show data input and data entry, or the data output documents that they're working on. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, Mike, but I don't know Diane Walters. I definitely made a note of it, and we'll look up and see what she's all about. Other questions? Okay, any other questions coming in? Anybody want to ask a question verbally through either the telephone or a microphone if you're using speakers? Okay, remember, if you're logging off, if you would please do File and then Exit End Webinar so that you get the questions, so you can give me some good feedback. That would be great. I'm not seeing any other questions come in, so I'm going to just hold on here for one more minute, and then if I don't see anything else come in a minute, we're going to go ahead and end early today. So since we went late on Tuesday, I guess that's a good thing. Any other questions? If you're in the process of writing a question, could you please raise your hand and let me know to hold on for a minute? Okay, there is a new question coming in. I will hold on. I feel like I should do the Jeopardy music. Da, 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 da. Okay. All right. Good, good, good. No, don't hurry. Eric, don't worry about it. I have plenty of time here. Okay. Are there any other book recommendations you have regards to judoka? You know, I don't. There are a number of manufacturing books out there, and I actually read manufacturing books. Even though I never work in manufacturing, I do read them because I think the principles apply, and they give me great ideas for ways that you could maybe view data or a drawing in the case of engineering, or a report request, or a REST report, or a whatever it may be, a loan request, anything like that. So I do read manufacturing. In the office side of things, I haven't seen a whole lot other than those chapters that I mentioned, and I actually Googled yesterday because I don't always keep up on every single new book that's coming out. I Googled as I was preparing for this error proofing and mistake proofing and quality thesaurus and judoka, and I didn't see anything out there that was new to Office or specific to non-manufacturing. So no, I'm sorry, I really don't have any other recommendations. Good idea for someone. Okay, something else just came in, so let me look at this. Okay, so Stacy has a question. You mentioned it is the process and not the people. At what point do you look at the individual? For example, if a majority of a team is struggling with something, but several are struggling more than others. So I think what I would do here, because I do see this a lot, that there'll be a very, in fact, there's usually a pretty broad bell curve on the output of a team from high quality consistently, never a problem, to consistent output problems. And what I always come back to is why. What is the root cause? So something that I was talking with a client yesterday about was, I think when you have these errors that are being discovered, there needs to be a very structured way about talking about that error with the person so that you start pulling together consistent data about root causes. And this needs to be a very constructive conversation with absolutely not a shred of blame in it. It needs to be approached from a curiosity, and frankly, needs to be approached from a, you know what, we feel we are somehow failing you and we want to stop doing that. So help us understand what specifically caused these errors so that we can figure out a way to help you through systems, environment, process, so that we can reduce it. And actually I'm having a continuing conversation with this person tomorrow about that need to get much more specific information from people as close in real time to when the errors are being made as possible, because we consider that the trail is still warm, and people will start forgetting, especially in a high volume environment, they'll start forgetting that particular person, and they won't remember what caused the error. So I think it's just having those questions of why did that happen, what would be helpful for you so that you don't keep doing this, and having those heart-to-heart conversations that perhaps we don't. I also think that we can't assume that supervisors all have high-quality conversations with frontline people when these problems are being discovered. I think some are very good at having those conversations, and other people have no business being supervisors, to be honest, because they don't approach it in a helpful, curious, we've met the enemy and it is us kind of way. So I don't know if that's specific enough for what you're referring to, Stacy, but I do think that there needs to be a more structured interview, quote unquote, on every single error. And it's tedious as all get out. But until you do it over and over and over and over and get to the root cause and put countermeasures in place, you're never going to solve the problem. And one last thing that I just thought of, one of the things, I actually was looking at a report yesterday or day before yesterday from an organization having these problems. And you know, what I keep hearing from the organization is there's just no rhyme or reason. One person will be great for a while and then they start having these errors, and it won't be any specific kind of error. But what I was doing is I was looking at the errors, and there were examples of the errors, and I was posing to the person I was talking with, who was a senior leader, so what are the possible reasons for this? And we were talking through some of the reasons, and one of the things that came out was that it goes back to something I said earlier. It was that the data that was being provided was likely not clean. And so I said, well, then that's not this person's fault or problem. That is the data entry place's issue. And so if you need to focus on cleaning that up in order to get the quality in better output form down the road. So I don't know. I thank you. I hope that does help. I see you said thanks. So there's a lot to it, and it's very, very specific. Quality problems need to be very, very specifically addressed. Okay, any other questions? So if you'll do me a favor, raise your hand if you're still writing something, then I'll hang on. Just click your, okay. All right, I will hold on. I see someone's writing. Don't rush. We've got 10 minutes. Oh, and I'm going to go back to something else Stacy said. Is Stacy still on? Yeah, she's still there. So one more thing to think about is the one-on-one is vitally important, and I think one-on-one for every single error in a very structured and standardized way. But I also think it's helpful to set a really supportive environment for the high performers and the low performers to be together, and the high performers to share how they do. Now, oftentimes I actually talk with them in advance and say, you know, look, you're a superstar. Everyone knows you're a superstar. You don't need to throw that in anyone's face. So let's just be very humble about it and very constructive in helping understand root causes. And then go to the low performers in advance and say, look, you know, this is a community. We're helping each other. We're all in this together, and we're going to talk through specifics. And maybe you can learn from some of the other staff some tricks that maybe would be helpful for you, and you know, kind of set that stage so it's a very open and honest environment. I think those kinds of things can help as well. Okay, so Pablo, I see your hand up. Now, I'm not sure whether that means you want to ask verbally or you're still at. Okay, so your hand just went down. Oh, now it's up. All right, I'm going to unmute you because I think this might mean you want to ask verbally. So I'm going to unmute you. Pablo, are you there?
Yes, I am, but I didn't have a question. I just noticed my hand was up, so I just making sure I wouldn't confuse you.
Okay, all right. Well, thanks so much. I'll put your hand down for you, and I'll mute you again.
All right.
Thank you. Okay, a couple other questions coming in. So when you do discipline for quality, is it when you know you have good process standards, so at that point it could be related back to the individual? You know, I actually have never been in an environment where we disciplined for quality standards. I think the minute you start disciplining, here's what I would suggest. I would suggest that if someone is consistently not delivering the quality that you need, and you are relatively sure that you've got great process standards in place, which I would not be sure of, okay, but if you were sure that you had great quality standards in place, okay, you know, good, I would suggest that what needs to happen is a better job fit for that person. And have it not be viewed at all as a disciplinary action, but rather, you know, some people are good at details and some aren't. Some are more visionary and creative, and there are phenomenal places to put them in an organization where they can not only survive their job but thrive in their jobs. And that job fit piece is absolutely vital. And in fact, at Toyota, this is something I learned when I was at a wonderful conference a few months ago in Long Beach. They do very extensive testing for all their employees because they're so into job fit. And so they've got these very extensive, not academic tests, but they're task tests, and to test whether someone is good with details, for example. So I know your environment, so in your environment, you might want to consider adding some sort of a test to the employment process to make sure you've got people who are good at working on details and working at a fairly fast pace and that type of thing. So I don't know, I actually take discipline out of my language when it comes to people, and I start using discipline to mean a disciplined approach to problem solving and a disciplined approach to workforce development, and that's how I prefer we use the term discipline. Okay, so let's see. Good. Good. So it sounds like you are moving away from discipline and that you're just moving them into other areas. And I think it's critical on how you move them into another area. I think it's critical to have a discussion. So for example, I have found employees that don't like what they do are typically not good at doing it. And I have found that people who are not good at doing something typically don't like what they do. And they may have just gotten locked into something, or who knows the reasons why people get into certain job roles. But I typically have had some success with great conversations on, do you really like this work? And usually they're like, oh, I really don't, because no one wants to be delivering bad quality, or very few people. Most people want to be superstars, and it's just a matter of finding the right place for them to be able to thrive and perform at high levels. So good. I'm glad that you're having that constructive approach to this. Good job. Okay, anything else? Any other questions? Well, I think we may be done then. So thank you very much, everyone. Hope to see you on some webinars in the near future. Kaizen events in A3 coming up, and then the sustainability one, again, I'll set that for October or possibly early November once my schedule gets settled. So thanks very much. Have a great day, and lean on. Bye-bye.